Rebecca Taylor's hands moved with surgical precision as she knelt beside the jammed rifle, her blonde hair tucked beneath a warm baseball cap. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's elite training range, but the warmth couldn't penetrate the chill that had settled over the assembled operators. "Want us to color code the instructions for you, sweetheart?" The voice belonged to Master Sergeant Derek Coleman, a mountain of a man whose presence commanded attention even when he wasn't speaking. His words dripped with the kind of condescension that had become as familiar to Rebecca as her morning coffee. She didn't flinch. 5 years of civilian life had taught her to swallow responses that would have gotten her court-martialed in her previous existence. Instead, she continued her methodical examination of the weapon, her calloused fingers finding problems that others had missed. "Maybe you're better suited to building toys in the armory," Coleman continued, his voice carrying across the range where a dozen elite operators had gathered for their morning qualification. The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, designed to cut deep. Rebecca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd faced down Taliban fighters in mountain caves, survived firefights that lasted 18 hours, and carried wounded teammates through hostile territory. But somehow, this daily humiliation felt like a different kind of warfare, one where her weapons were useless. The rifle in her hands was an older model, probably stored improperly for months. Without even firing a test round, she could already diagnose 3 separate malfunctions. The gas tube showed signs of corrosion, the buffer spring had lost its tension, and someone had clearly used the wrong ammunition type repeatedly. But voicing these observations would only invite more mockery. "Earth to Barbie," Coleman's voice boomed again. "We don't have all day." As Rebecca reached for her cleaning rod, her sleeve rode up slightly. For just a moment, the edge of black ink became visible against her pale skin. Coleman was mid-sentence when he caught sight of it, his words dying in his throat like a radio. Suddenly cut to static, but the moment passed too quickly. Rebecca tugged her sleeve back down, and Coleman's verbal assault resumed as if nothing had happened. The other operators hadn't noticed their leader's brief hesitation, too busy enjoying their morning entertainment at her expense. What they didn't know was that Rebecca Taylor had once been someone else entirely, someone whose real name was classified in Pentagon files and whose call sign had become legend among those who operated in the shadows. 5 years ago, she'd been Chief Petty Officer Rebecca Hayes, known in certain circles as Ghost, the first woman to complete the Navy's most grueling special operations training. Now she was just another contractor, invisible by choice, spending her days maintaining the weapons that kept America's elite warriors alive. She'd chosen this existence deliberately, trading glory for anonymity, recognition for the simple satisfaction of ensuring that no operator would ever die because their weapon failed them. The calluses on her hands told a story she'd never voice. They were in the wrong places for someone who'd only ever been a gunsmith. Between her thumb and forefinger, she bore the marks of someone who'd spent thousands of hours gripping a rifle stock. Along the edges of her palms, smooth spots worn by fast roping from helicopters. On her knees, permanent reminders of countless hours in prone firing positions. These were the hands of someone who'd lived behind a weapon, not just maintained. 1. Rebecca finished her initial assessment and stood slowly, her movements economical and controlled. "The rifle needs a complete overhaul," she said quietly. "Gas system's compromised, buffer spring shot, and there's fouling throughout the action." Coleman's response was predictable. "Lucky guess. Anyone could see this thing's been sitting in storage." But there was something different in his voice now, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. As the operators dispersed to their various training exercises, Rebecca began the methodical process of breaking down the weapon. Each component told her a story, how it had been used, abused, and neglected. She worked with the focused intensity of someone performing surgery, because in her mind, That's exactly what this was. Every weapon she serviced might be the difference between life and death for someone's son, daughter, husband, or wife. Every rifle she rebuilt carried the weight of a promise she'd made 5 years ago in the mountains of Afghanistan, kneeling beside 3 flag-draped coffins. The promise that no one else would die on her watch. Across the range, Lieutenant Commander James Wilson observed the quiet contractor with growing curiosity. Something about her diagnostic technique triggered memories he couldn't quite place. These weren't skills taught in civilian programs. They were learned through blood, sweat, and the kind of experience that came only from combat. Wilson had served long enough to recognize the signs. The way Rebecca maintained perfect balance even when kneeling. How her eyes constantly tracked movement and exits. The subtle flinch when aircraft passed overhead, not from fear, but from the muscle memory of someone who'd taken fire from above. Most telling of all was the way she'd handled that rifle. Not like a technician examining a tool, but like a warrior greeting an old friend. As Rebecca worked, completely absorbed in her task, she had no idea that her carefully constructed anonymity was about to crumble. The tattoo hidden beneath her sleeve was more than just ink. It was a roadmap to a past she'd tried to bury. A testament to sacrifices that still haunted her dreams. In the shadows of the armory, another figure watched with protective intensity. Frank Torres had been working at Fort Bragg for 3 years, maintaining his own cover as a senior armorer. Like Rebecca, he'd chosen invisibility over recognition, but his reasons were different. He was there to watch over a sister-in-arms who'd saved his life more times than he could count. The ghost of Coronado wasn't as alone as she thought. But some secrets are too powerful to stay buried forever, and the reckoning that had been building for 5 years was about to begin. Coleman's cruelty had awakened something in Rebecca that she'd tried to suppress. The warrior who'd never really died, only learned to hide. The question wasn't whether her true identity would be revealed, but what would happen when it was. In a world where respect was earned through blood and sacrifice, Rebecca Taylor was about to discover that some ghost is too powerful for even the living to ignore. The morning sun climbed higher, but for Rebecca, the real battle was just beginning. Master Sergeant Derek Coleman had made Rebecca Taylor his personal project, and everyone on the base knew it. At 6 feet 2 inches of muscle and misplaced pride, he'd built his reputation on the belief that women diluted the warrior culture he'd spent 20 years defending. His morning briefings now included pointed comments about maintaining standards and remembering what real warriors look like. Rebecca had become his favorite target, and he'd elevated the harassment to an art form. Taylor. Coleman's voice boomed across the armory at 0600 hours. Less than stellar work on that rifle yesterday. Looks like you need some remedial training in basic maintenance. The assignment was intentionally humiliating, cleaning the latrines while other contractors worked on million-dollar weapon systems. Rebecca accepted the task with the same mechanical precision she applied to everything else, her face betraying nothing of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Make sure those toilets shine, Taylor. That's about your speed, isn't it? Coleman's laughter echoed through the facility, joined by the nervous chuckles of other contractors who were grateful not to be in his crosshairs. What Coleman didn't realize was that every degrading task, every cruel comment, every moment of public humiliation was being cataloged by someone who'd spent years learning to observe, analyze, and plan. Rebecca's silence wasn't submission. It was reconnaissance. As she scrubbed floors and cleaned facilities, she studied the base's power structure with the same intensity she'd once applied to enemy positions. Coleman's authority came from his position and the fear he inspired, but authority built on intimidation always had weak points. Rebecca just had to find them. The other operators followed Coleman's lead with increasing confidence. They'd comment on her appearance, question her competence, and make jokes about diversity quotas. Through it all, Rebecca maintained her steady silence, completing each task with the kind of attention to detail that had once made her legendary in special operations circles. But Coleman noticed something that bothered him more than he cared to admit. When Rebecca did work on weapons, she handled them with an intimacy that seemed wrong for a simple contractor. Her movements were too fluid, too certain. She never referenced technical manuals or asked for clarification. It was the difference between someone who'd studied anatomy and someone who'd performed surgery under fire. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Coleman arrived with a Senior 25 sniper rifle that had been in storage for months. He'd spent the previous evening sabotaging it with multiple failures, creating what he thought would be an impossible diagnostic challenge. "Attention, everyone," he announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a predator who'd cornered his. "Pray, let's have ourselves a little skills assessment. Taylor here thinks she's a weapons expert. Let's see if she can diagnose this rifle's problems." He set the weapon on her workbench with excessive force, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet armory. "Take your time, sweetheart. We all know thinking isn't your strong suit." Rebecca picked up the rifle, and something fundamental shifted in her demeanor. The change was subtle but unmistakable, the way a sleeping lion becomes instantly alert. At the first hint of danger, her hands moved over the weapon with the kind of certainty that came from handling similar systems in life-or-death situations. Without firing a shot, without even fully disassembling the weapon, she began her diagnosis. "Gas tube bent at approximately 3 degrees, she said, her voice steady and professional. Port fouling consistent with 700 rounds of steel case ammunition. Buffer spring compressed beyond specifications. Scope mount shows stress. Fractures from improper installation." She paused, setting the rifle down with deliberate care. "There's also scoring in the chamber consistent with corrosive ammunition. This weapon hasn't just been neglected, it's been deliberately damaged." The armory fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems. Coleman's face had gone pale, then red with embarrassment and rage. She'd found issues he hadn't even known existed, problems that would have taken most armorers hours to identify. "Lucky guesses," he managed, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. The other operators exchanged glances, some looking impressed despite themselves, others uncomfortable with the shift in dynamics. Coleman's response was to escalate to personal attacks. "You're one of those women who hangs around military bases, trying to feel important," he said, his voice rising with each word. "Playing soldier because you couldn't make it in the real world." For the first time since arriving at Fort Bragg, Rebecca's carefully controlled mask slipped. Her jaw tightened, and her left hand closed around a torque wrench with enough force to whiten her knuckles. For a moment, something dangerous flashed in her eyes, a glimpse of the warrior she'd been before choosing invisibility. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Rebecca's breathing changed, becoming controlled and measured, in a way that made Coleman's survival instincts scream warnings he didn't understand. She shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, but suddenly he was looking at someone entirely different. The wrench in her hand wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a weapon, and everyone in the room could feel it. For 3 heartbeats, Coleman stood inches from death, facing someone who could have ended him with surgical precision. Other operators sensed the shift without understanding it. Some primitive part of their brains recognized the presence of an apex predator, and they found themselves stepping back without conscious thought. But then, as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. Rebecca released the tool with visible effort, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a strike that had been perfectly planned and then deliberately aborted. She returned to documenting the rifle's problems, with mechanical precision, but everyone had felt it. Death had entered the room and chosen mercy. Across the armory, Lieutenant Commander James Wilson watched with growing certainty. He'd seen that particular transformation before, in the mountains of Afghanistan, when a slight figure had materialized from the darkness to eliminate 3 Taliban fighters who'd been preparing to execute his patrol. Wilson pulled out his secure phone and began accessing classified databases. His search parameters were specific: female special operations personnel, call sign Ghost, operation history in Afghanistan between 2015 and 2019. The results were heavily redacted. The one thing was clear: the woman cleaning latrines and fixing rifles was no ordinary contractor. She was someone who'd operated at the highest levels of special operations, someone whose very existence was classified. As Wilson studied Rebecca with new eyes, he noticed other details that formed a pattern. The way she maintained perfect situational awareness, even while focused on technical tasks. How she positioned herself to keep multiple exit routes available. The subtle scars on her hands that spoke of combat experience. Most telling of all was the way she'd handled Coleman's provocation. Lesser people would have either cowered or exploded. Rebecca had done neither. She'd calculated, planned, and then chosen restraint. That kind of control came from years of operating in situations where the wrong move meant death. Wilson's investigation was interrupted by a commotion near the main entrance. A convoy of black SUVs had arrived, and personnel were unloading equipment for what appeared to be a classified briefing. High-ranking officers emerged from the vehicles, their presence suggesting that something significant was about to happen. But Wilson's attention remained fixed on Rebecca, who'd gone completely still at the sound of approaching footsteps. For someone trying to remain invisible, she was about to face the greatest test of her carefully constructed anonymity. The net was closing, and the ghost of Coronado was running out of shadows to hide in. Coleman, still smarting from his public humiliation, was already planning his next move. If Rebecca Taylor thought she'd won this round, she had another thing coming. He'd find a way to break her, to expose whatever weakness kept her silent and compliant. What he didn't know was that his campaign of harassment was about to collide with forces far beyond his understanding. The woman he'd been tormenting wasn't just another contractor. She was someone whose true identity could reshape everything they thought they knew about strength, sacrifice, and what it meant to be a warrior. The reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning that started like any other. Rebecca arrived at the armory before dawn, as was her custom, to find her workstation completely destroyed. Tools scattered across the floor, technical manuals torn and scattered, and her carefully organized parts bins emptied and mixed together in a deliberate act of sabotage. Master Sergeant Coleman stood nearby, making no effort to hide his satisfaction. "Looks like someone had an accident," he said, his voice carrying across the facility for everyone to hear. "Better clean that up before the brass sees it. Wouldn't want anyone thinking you can't handle your responsibilities." Rebecca knelt among the scattered pieces of her professional life, her hands moving methodically to sort through the chaos. 5 years of careful emotional control had taught her to compartmentalize, to separate her feelings from her actions. But as she picked up a precision gauge that had been deliberately damaged, something cracked inside her chest. The gauge had belonged to David Martinez, one of the 3 teammates who died covering her retreat in Afghanistan. She'd carried it through 7 combat deployments, and it had never failed her once. Now it was broken, its calibration destroyed, rendered useless by someone who'd never understand its significance. "Problem, Taylor?" Coleman's voice held the satisfaction of a predator who'd finally drawn blood. "You look a little emotional. Maybe this job is too much for you, after all." Rebecca's hands trembled as she held the broken instrument. For a moment, she was back in those mountains, feeling the weight of David's body as she dragged him toward the extraction point. hearing his voice promising that everything would be okay, that they'd all make it home together. But they hadn't. All made it home. Only she had. I said, "Clean it up." Coleman's voice had taken on a harder edge. "Unless you need me to call someone to help you with basic housekeeping." The laughter that followed was cruel and sharp, designed to cut deep. But this time, Rebecca didn't absorb it in silence. This time, she stood up slowly, the broken gauge still clutched in her hands, and looked directly at Coleman for the first time in months. "You want to know what's wrong with me?" she said, her voice quiet but carrying a quality that made everyone in the armory stop what they were doing. "I'll tell you what's wrong with me." She rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the tattoo that had been hidden for 5 years. The seal trident was unmistakable, but this one was different from the standard design. 4 stars marked major operations, and microscopic text was etched along the waves of the trident's base. "Never forgotten," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "That's what it says. These names, David Martinez, Michael Johnson, Robert Thompson, they died because someone behind a desk made a bad call. They died covering my retreat because that's what warriors do for each other." The armory had gone completely silent. Even Coleman seemed frozen, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as the implications sank in. "I was Chief Petty Officer Rebecca Hayes," she continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded respect in the world's most dangerous places. "Call sign Ghost. I served with SEAL Team 9 for 7 years. I was the first woman to complete the Crucible, a 72-hour solo survival exercise that breaks most men." She began walking toward Coleman, her movements controlled and purposeful. "In Somalia, I eliminated 12 hostage takers in complete darkness using only a knife and my sidearm. The hostages never saw my face. 23 American contractors owe their lives to what I did in Syria, though none of them know my name." Coleman's face had gone pale, but Rebecca wasn't finished. "I spent 7 years in the shadows so people like you could stand in the light. I've seen things that would break your mind and done things that would haunt your dreams. I left that world behind because I thought I'd found something better, a place where I could serve quietly, where I could honor the dead by keeping the living safe." She stopped directly in front of Coleman, close enough that he could see the scars on her hands, the calculated way she held herself, the absolute certainty in her eyes. "But you know what I discovered? Some people don't deserve the sacrifices others make for them. Some people are so small, so petty, so consumed by their own insecurities that they can't recognize honor when it's standing right in front of them." The assembled operators had formed a loose circle, drawn by the raw intensity of the moment. Several were recording on their phones, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something that would become legend. Coleman tried to speak, but Rebecca cut him off. "For 5 years, I've let you humiliate me because I thought it didn't matter. I thought I was here to serve, not to be served. But you just destroyed something that belonged to a dead hero, and that changes everything." She held up the broken gauge, its metal surface catching the fluorescent lights. "This belonged to David Martinez. He was 24 years old, from El Paso, Texas. He played guitar and wrote letters to his little sister every week. He died because he refused to leave me behind, even though I ordered him to." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. "Every tool I use, every weapon I service, every moment I spend in this place is about honoring him and the others who didn't make it home. You don't get to mock that. You don't get to destroy that. Not anymore." Coleman found his voice at last. I didn't know." "You didn't know because you never asked," Rebecca replied, her voice hardening again. "You saw a woman and decided she didn't belong. You saw someone who wouldn't fight back and decided she was weak. You made assumptions based on your own limitations. And now you're going to face the consequences. Lieutenant Commander Wilson stepped forward from the crowd. Chief Hayes, he said, his voice carrying the respect of someone who knew exactly who he was addressing. My name is James Wilson. You saved my patrol outside Kandahar in 2018. We never got the chance to thank you properly. The recognition rippled through the assembled operators like a shockwave. Some of them had heard stories about the ghost of Coronado, legends passed down through the special operations community. None of them had imagined she was here, working. Among them in silence. Rebecca's mask finally cracked completely, years of suppressed emotion breaking through her carefully maintained control. I don't need thanks, she said, her voice thick with pain. I need the dead to stay dead instead of haunting the living. She turned back to Coleman, who was still standing frozen in place. You want to know what real strength looks like? It's not about dominating people who can't fight back. It's about serving something bigger than yourself, even when nobody's watching. It's about honoring the fallen by protecting the living. She picked up another piece of her scattered equipment. This one, a specialized tool that had been bent deliberately. You spent months trying to break me, but you don't understand what I'm made of. I've been broken before, truly broken, by things that actually matter. What you've done is just noise. The crowd continued to grow as word spread through the base. Senior officers began arriving, drawn by reports of a situation that required immediate attention. But Rebecca seemed oblivious to the growing audience, focused entirely on the man who'd made her life a daily hell. I could have ended you a dozen times over the past few months, she said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute conviction. There were moments when you pushed so hard that every instinct the first possessed was screaming for violence. But I chose restraint because that's what warriors do. We protect, even when the people we're protecting don't deserve it. She stood up slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. But protection has limits. Push too far, threaten what's sacred, and you'll discover that some ghosts are more dangerous than the living. Coleman finally found his voice. What? What are you going to do? Rebecca's smile was sharp and cold. I'm going to teach you what accountability looks like. I'm going to show you what happens when someone who's actually dangerous decides to fight back. And I'm going to do it using the system you thought would protect you. She began walking toward the armory's main office, her purpose clear to everyone watching. Coleman had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the reckoning he'd been building toward for months was finally at hand. The ghost of Coronado was about to become visible again, and when she did, nothing would ever be the same. Rebecca's first stop wasn't the commanding officer's office or the base inspector general. Instead, she walked calmly to the armory's administrative station and began documenting everything with the systematic precision that had made her legendary in special operations circles. Every incident, every witness, every violation of military protocol and federal employment law was cataloged with photographic evidence and detailed timestamps. Coleman had been so confident in his authority that he'd never bothered to hide his actions. Now, that arrogance was about to become his downfall. What are you doing? Coleman demanded, following her across the armory floor. The confidence in his voice was beginning to crack as he watched Rebecca work with the focused intensity of someone executing a battle plan. I'm gathering evidence, she replied without looking up from her documentation. Federal contractors have the same workplace protections as any other employee. What you've been doing constitutes harassment, hostile work environment, and destruction of personal property. She photographed the scattered tools, the torn manuals, the deliberately damaged equipment. Each image was time-stamped and GP tagged, creating an irrefutable record of Coleman's sabotage. You can't prove I did anything, Coleman said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was beginning to understand that the woman he'd been tormenting wasn't just another civilian contractor. She was someone who'd spent years operating in environments where attention to detail meant the difference between life and death. Rebecca's smile was sharp and cold. "You're right. I can't prove you personally destroyed my equipment, but I can prove that it happened on your watch, in your facility, under your supervision. And I can prove that you've created a hostile work environment that enabled it." She moved to her computer terminal and began accessing files that Coleman didn't even know existed. Security camera footage, email records, witness statements that she'd been quietly collecting for months. Every cruel comment, every degrading assignment, every moment of public humiliation had been recorded and preserved. "How did you ... Coleman's voice trailed off as he realized the scope of her preparation. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to his latest provocation. It was the culmination of a carefully planned campaign. "I've been building a case against you for 3 months, Rebecca said, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Did you think I was just going to endure your harassment forever? I'm a former Navy SEAL, not a victim." Lieutenant Commander Wilson approached with obvious concern. "Chief Hayes, perhaps we should discuss this through proper channels, ... "I am using proper channels," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded respect in the world's most dangerous places. "Master Sergeant, Coleman has violated numerous military regulations and federal employment laws. He's about to face the consequences of his actions." She turned to address the growing crowd of operators and contractors who'd gathered to witness the confrontation. "How many of you have seen Coleman harass female personnel? How many have witnessed him creating hostile work environments? How many have been too afraid to speak up because you thought his rank protected him?" Hands began to rise slowly, reluctantly at first, then with growing confidence. What had seemed like isolated incidents suddenly revealed themselves as part of a systematic pattern of abuse. "I've been documenting everything," Rebecca continued, her voice carrying across the armory. "Every witness, every incident, every violation. The evidence is overwhelming, and it's all going to the appropriate authorities." Coleman's face had gone pale as he realized the trap he'd walked into. "You can't do this. I have connections, I have influence." "You have nothing," Rebecca replied, her voice cutting through his bravado like a blade. "You're a mid-level non-commissioned officer who's been abusing his authority to harass subordinates. When this becomes public, your connections will disappear. Faster than you can say early retirement." She began uploading her evidence to secure servers, each file tagged with relevant statutes and regulations. Federal workplace harassment, violation of equal employment opportunity laws, destruction of personal property, abuse of authority. The charges were mounting. "You want to know what real power looks like?" Rebecca said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It's not about intimidating people who can't fight back. It's about understanding systems, following procedures, and using the law to protect the innocent." Frank Torres, the quiet armorer who'd been watching from the shadows, stepped forward. "Chief Hayes isn't the only one with evidence," he said, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone turn to look at him. "I've been documenting Coleman's behavior for years. Sexual harassment, racial discrimination, abuse of authority. It's all here." He produced a thick folder filled with photographs, statements, and recorded conversations. "Some of us have been waiting for someone with the courage to make a stand. Today's that day." Coleman's world was crumbling around him, but his response was predictable. He escalated to threats. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I can make your life hell. I can make sure you never work on a military installation again." Rebecca's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You're going to threaten me? A decorated Navy SEAL who's seen actual combat? You think your petty authority means anything to someone who's faced real danger?" She stood up slowly, her movements controlled. and deliberate. Let me explain something to you, Coleman. I've been shot at by actual enemies, people who were trying to kill me and my teammates. I've operated in countries where capture meant torture and death. I've seen things that would break your mind and done things that would haunt your dreams. She began walking toward him, her presence somehow filling the entire space. Your harassment, your threats, your attempts to intimidate me, they're nothing. Less than nothing. You're a playground bully who's never faced real consequences for his actions. The crowd parted as she approached Coleman, who was now backing away despite himself. But here's what you don't understand. I don't need to hurt you physically, to destroy you. I have something much more powerful than violence. I have the truth, documented and verifiable, ready to be presented to people who actually matter. She pulled out her phone and began making calls, her voice professional and controlled. Colonel Martinez, this is Rebecca Hayes. I need to report a serious violation of military protocol and federal employment law. Coleman watched in horror as his carefully constructed world began to collapse. The woman he'd been tormenting for months wasn't just fighting back. She was systematically dismantling his entire career with surgical precision. Inspector General's office? I have evidence of systematic harassment and abuse of authority. That requires immediate investigation. Each call was another nail in Coleman's coffin. Rebecca wasn't just filing complaints. She was building a case that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. Years of experience in special operations had taught her that the most effective battles were won with intelligence and preparation, not brute force. Base Commander's office? I need to schedule an urgent meeting regarding hostile work environment and violation of federal contractor rights. By the time she finished making calls, Coleman was a broken man. The authority he'd wielded so carelessly was evaporating, replaced by the cold reality of official scrutiny and legal consequences. You have 24 hours to prepare your defense, Rebecca said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. I suggest you use that time wisely, because when this becomes public, your career will be over. She turned to address the crowd one final time. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can abuse their authority without consequences. Real strength isn't about dominating the weak, it's about protecting them. And sometimes, protecting them means making sure the bullies face justice. The ghost of Coronado had revealed herself, and her first act of war was about to begin. The investigation moved with the swift efficiency of a military operation. Within 6 hours of Rebecca's formal complaints, representatives from the Inspector General's Office, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and Base Security were conducting interviews throughout Fort Bragg. Coleman's attempts to control the narrative crumbled immediately. His superiors, faced with documented evidence of systematic harassment and the revelation that they'd been allowing the mistreatment of a decorated Navy SEAL, moved into damage control mode. Master Sergeant Coleman, Colonel Patricia Hayes said, her voice carrying the chill of a Minnesota winter. You are hereby relieved of your duties pending a full investigation. You will report to the base legal office immediately. Coleman's world collapsed in real time. The authority he'd wielded so carelessly was gone, replaced by the cold reality of official scrutiny. His attempts to rally support among his subordinates failed as one by one, they provided statements confirming Rebecca's documentation. I tried to stop him, said Staff Sergeant Martinez, one of Coleman's former allies. But he said Chief Hayes was just another contractor, that she didn't deserve respect. I should have spoken up sooner. The testimony painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond Rebecca's experience. Female personnel throughout the base came forward with their own stories of harassment, discrimination, and hostile work environments. Coleman's reign of terror had touched dozens of lives, but the most damaging revelation came from an unexpected source, Coleman's own records. Rebecca's investigation had uncovered a pattern of complaints that had been dismissed or buried. Over the years, previous victims who'd been silenced or transferred suddenly found their voices again. He told me that if I filed a complaint, he'd make sure I never worked on a military base again, said Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a logistics officer who'd been transferred after refusing Coleman's advances. I thought I was alone, that no one would believe me against a senior NCO. Rebecca's systematic approach had uncovered a network of abuse that stretched back years. Each victim who came forward strengthened the case, creating an avalanche of evidence that no amount of influence could stop. The media attention was immediate and intense. News of a decorated female Navy SEAL being harassed by a military supervisor became a national story within hours. Reporter after reporter contacted the base, seeking interviews and additional information. Coleman's attempts to spin the narrative backfired spectacularly. His lawyer's statement that he'd been maintaining military standards was demolished. When Rebecca's service record became public, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, the decorations spoke for themselves. She's more qualified than half the men on this base, said Master Chief Peterson, a 20-year veteran who'd served with Rebecca years earlier. Anyone who disrespected her was either ignorant or stupid. In Coleman's case, probably both. The investigation revealed the true scope of Coleman's misconduct. Financial irregularities in equipment purchases, falsified training records, and evidence of favoritism based on personal relationships rather than merit. What had started as a harassment complaint had uncovered systematic corruption. Frank Torres emerged as a key witness, his own decorated service record lending credibility to his testimony. I've been documenting Coleman's behavior for 3 years, he told investigators. Chief Hayes wasn't his first victim, just the one who finally had the courage to fight back. The revelation that Torres was also a former SEAL assigned to protect Rebecca sent shockwaves through the special operations community. 2 decorated warriors had been working in anonymity, serving quietly while being harassed by someone who'd never seen combat. The Ghost Foundation, Torres explained to investigators, provides support and protection for special operations veterans who choose civilian careers. We watch over each other because the system doesn't always recognize what we've sacrificed. The Foundation's existence revealed a hidden network of elite warriors working in civilian roles throughout the military-industrial complex. Mechanics, technicians, contractors, and consultants who traded glory for anonymity, serving their country in ways that would never make headlines. Coleman's defense team tried desperately to shift blame, suggesting that Rebecca had somehow provoked the harassment through her own behavior. The strategy backfired completely when security footage emerged showing Coleman's systematic campaign of humiliation. The evidence is overwhelming, said Colonel Hayes, addressing the media circus that had descended on Fort Bragg. Master Sergeant Coleman violated numerous military regulations and federal employment laws. He will face both military and civilian charges. The base commander's statement was carefully crafted to distance the military from Coleman's actions, while acknowledging the systemic failures that had enabled them. We failed Chief Hayes and other victims by not recognizing the severity of the situation. That ends now. Rebecca watched the proceedings with mixed emotions. Justice was being served, but she took no satisfaction in Coleman's downfall. Her goal had never been revenge, it had been protection, ensuring that others wouldn't suffer the same treatment. I don't celebrate anyone's destruction, she told Lieutenant Commander Wilson during a private meeting. But some people leave you no choice. Coleman could have changed his behavior at any time. Instead, he chose to escalate until consequences became inevitable. The ripple effects extended far beyond Fort Bragg. Military installations across the country began reviewing their own harassment policies and investigating previously dismissed complaints. Rebecca's case had become a catalyst for systemic change. Coleman's final desperate gambit was to claim that he'd been suffering from PTSD, that his behavior was the result of combat stress rather than malicious intent. The defense collapsed when investigators discovered that Coleman had never deployed to a combat zone, despite 20 years of service. "He's a fraud," said Sergeant Major Williams, reviewing Coleman's personnel file. "All those stories about combat experience, about understanding what warriors go through, complete fiction. He was a support soldier who convinced people he was something he wasn't." The revelation that Coleman had been lying about his own service record for years completed his destruction. Fellow NCOs who'd supported him out of misplaced loyalty felt betrayed and angry. The warrior culture he'd claimed to protect had been built on deception. As the investigation concluded, Rebecca found herself facing an unexpected choice. Multiple offers poured in from defense contractors, private security firms, and government agencies. Her revelation had made her one of the most sought-after professionals in the military-industrial complex. But the most intriguing offer came from an unexpected source, the Pentagon itself. General Patricia Hayes, no relation to Rebecca despite sharing a surname, arrived at Fort Bragg with a proposal that would change everything. "We're standing up a new program," the general explained during a classified briefing. "Female Special. Operations candidates need instructors who understand what they're facing. We need you to teach them not just tactics, but how to survive in a culture that isn't always welcoming." Rebecca's response was immediate and non-negotiable. "I'll do it under one condition. Master Sergeant Coleman attends every training session. He needs to learn what real warriors look like." The general's eyebrows rose. "That's unconventional. Coleman will be facing court-martial and likely imprisonment. Why would you want him involved?" Rebecca's smile was sharp and cold. "Because the best way to change a broken system is to educate the people who broke it. Coleman spent months trying to break me down. Now he's going to watch me build others up." The symmetry was perfect, and everyone in the room understood its power. The man who tried to destroy a decorated warrior would be forced to witness her, creating the next generation of female special operations personnel. Coleman's fate was sealed, but his real punishment was just beginning. The ghost of Coronado was about to become visible again, and when she did, she would ensure that his legacy became a cautionary tale about the price of abusing power. The walls he'd built around his authority were crumbling, and Rebecca was standing in the ruins, ready to build something better from the wreckage. The courtroom was packed with military personnel, media representatives, and federal investigators. Master Sergeant Derek Coleman sat at the defendant's table, his dress uniform stripped of the decorations he'd worn with such pride. The man who'd once commanded through fear and intimidation now looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his own actions. Rebecca entered the courtroom wearing a simple black suit, her blonde hair pulled back in the same utilitarian style she'd maintained for years. But now everyone knew who she was. The ghost of Coronado walked among them, no longer hidden by anonymity. "The prosecution calls Chief Petty Officer Rebecca Hayes to the stand," announced Major Lisa Rodriguez, the military prosecutor who'd taken on Coleman's case with the determination of someone who'd seen too many bullies escape justice. Rebecca's testimony was devastating in its precision. She recounted months of systematic harassment with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to mission planning. Every incident was documented, every witness identified, every violation of military protocol and federal law laid bare. "Master Sergeant Coleman told me that women like me were the reason good soldiers died," Rebecca said, her voice steady and professional. "He said I was playing soldier, that I didn't belong in a warrior culture. He assigned me to clean latrines while male contractors with less experience worked on advanced weapon systems." Coleman's defense attorney, a civilian lawyer who'd clearly underestimated the case, tried to suggest that Rebecca had misunderstood military culture. The strategy backfired immediately when Rebecca's service record was presented to the jury. "Objection sustained," said Colonel Margaret Thompson, the military judge presiding over the case. "The defendant's counsel will not question the plaintiff's understanding of military culture. Her record speaks for itself." The evidence mounted relentlessly. Security footage showed Coleman's systematic campaign of humiliation. Email records revealed his attempts to have Rebecca transferred or terminated. Witness after witness confirmed the hostile work environment he'd created. But the most damaging testimony came from Coleman's own subordinates. Staff Sergeant Martinez, visibly uncomfortable, described how Coleman had ordered him to sabotage Rebecca's equipment. "He said it was a training exercise," Martinez testified, "that we were testing her diagnostic abilities. But I knew it was wrong. I should have refused the order." The revelation that Coleman had ordered the destruction of Rebecca's personal equipment, including items that belonged to her fallen teammates, sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Even hardened military personnel looked disgusted by the deliberate cruelty. Coleman's lawyer made a desperate attempt to portray his client as a victim of changing military culture, someone who'd been unfairly targeted for maintaining traditional standards. The defense collapsed when Frank Torres took the stand. "I served with Chief Hayes for 3 years, Torres testified, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak. "She never asked for special treatment, never. Complained about hardships, never showed anything but complete professionalism. Coleman's treatment of her was personal, malicious, and completely inappropriate." The jury learned about the Ghost Foundation, the network of elite veterans who'd chosen civilian careers while maintaining their bonds of brotherhood. Torres's testimony revealed how they'd been quietly documenting Coleman's behavior, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss. "We protect our own," Torres explained. "Not because we're looking for trouble, but because we know what real sacrifice looks like." Coleman never understood that. The prosecution's final witness was Lieutenant Commander James Wilson, whose testimony about Rebecca's combat service provided context that made Coleman's harassment even more inexcusable. "Chief Hayes saved my life and the lives of my entire patrol," Wilson said, his voice thick with emotion. "She appeared out of nowhere, eliminated 3 Taliban fighters who were about to execute us, and then vanished before we could even thank her. She's a genuine American hero." He turned to look directly at Coleman. The fact that someone like her was subjected to harassment and humiliation by someone who never saw combat is a disgrace to the uniform we all wear. When Coleman finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony was a disaster. His lawyer had clearly hoped that his client's 20 years of service would generate sympathy, but Coleman's arrogance and refusal to accept responsibility destroyed any chance of leniency. "I was maintaining standards," Coleman insisted, his voice carrying the same condescending tone that had tormented Rebecca for months. "The military isn't a social experiment. Women like her don't belong in warrior culture." The prosecutors' cross-examination was surgical in its precision. "Master Sergeant Coleman, you've stated that you were maintaining warrior standards. Can you describe your combat experience?" Coleman's face went pale. I served in support roles, ... Support roles? So you never deployed to a combat zone?" "No, but..." "You never faced enemy fire?" "No." "You never carry a wounded teammate to safety?" "No." "You never made life or death decisions under fire?" "No." The prosecutor's voice rose with each question. "So you, someone with no combat experience, felt qualified to judge the worthiness of a decorated Navy SEAL who saved American lives in multiple combat operations?" Coleman's silence was answer enough. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. guilty of harassment, abuse of authority, destruction of personal property, and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. Colonel Thompson's sentencing was swift and comprehensive. Master Sergeant Coleman, your actions have brought disgrace to the uniform and violated the trust placed in you by your subordinates and superiors. You are hereby sentenced to reduction in rank to private, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and dismissal from the United States Army. But the military justice was only the beginning. Federal prosecutors had already filed charges for violations of employment law and civil rights. Coleman would face additional trials in civilian court, with potential prison time and financial penalties. As the courtroom emptied, Rebecca found herself face to face with Coleman for the first time since his arrest. He looked broken, defeated, a shadow of the man who'd once wielded authority with such cruel efficiency. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I'm sorry." Rebecca studied him for a long moment, seeing not the bully who'd tormented her, but a broken man who'd finally understood the cost of his actions. "Your apology isn't for me," she said finally. "It's for everyone you hurt, everyone you silenced, everyone you drove away from serving their country." She paused, her voice softening slightly. "But if you truly want to make amends, there's something you can do. Help us build something better. Help us ensure that no one else goes through what your victims experienced." Coleman's eyes filled with tears. "How? After everything I'd done, how could I possibly help?" Rebecca's smile was sad but genuine. "By telling your story. By explaining how someone becomes a bully, how power corrupts, how good people can make terrible choices. Your experience could prevent others from following the same path." It was an offer of redemption that Coleman didn't deserve. But Rebecca had seen enough destruction to know that sometimes the best way to honor the fallen was to save the living, even when they'd been the ones causing harm. The ghost of Coronado had revealed herself, fought her battle, and won her war. But her greatest victory wasn't Coleman's downfall. It was the possibility that his destruction might prevent others from suffering the same fate. Justice had been served, but the real work was just beginning. 6 months after Coleman's conviction, Rebecca stood before the first class of the Military Women's Special Operations Training Program. The facility was state-of-the-art, built with funding that had materialized almost overnight once her story became public. But the most unusual aspect of the program wasn't the equipment or the location. It was the presence of Derek Coleman, now a private, sitting in the back row. "Some of you are wondering why he's here," Rebecca said, addressing the elephant in the room directly. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned respect through blood and sacrifice. "Former Master Sergeant Coleman represents everything this program is designed to overcome." 24 female candidates sat in perfect formation, their faces revealing mixture of curiosity, determination, and barely contained anger. They'd all heard the story of the ghost of Coronado and the man who tried to break her. "He's here because understanding your enemy is the first step in defeating them," Rebecca continued. "Coleman didn't invent sexism in the military. He just perfected it. If you're going to succeed in special operations, you need to understand the mindset that will try to destroy you." Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The man who'd once commanded through fear and intimidation was now learning what vulnerability felt like. Every eye in the room was on him, and none of them were friendly. "Private Coleman," Rebecca's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Tell them what you were thinking when you decided I didn't belong in a warrior culture." Coleman's hand shook as he stood up. The uniform he wore bore no decorations, no signs of the authority he'd once wielded. I thought strength only looked one way. I thought that if women succeeded in special operations, it somehow diminished what men had accomplished." His voice cracked slightly. "I was wrong, completely, fundamentally wrong. But I believed It's so strongly that I was willing to destroy someone who was better than me in every way that mattered. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Rebecca had structured the program to force both the candidates and Coleman to confront uncomfortable truths about military culture, systemic bias, and the price of prejudice. Private Coleman will attend every training session, Rebecca announced. He'll observe, he'll learn, and he'll document what real warriors look like. His presence is part of his rehabilitation, but it's also part of your education. The training itself was unlike anything the military had ever attempted. Rebecca combined traditional special operations techniques with innovations designed specifically for female operators. She taught leverage over strength, strategy over brute force, intelligence over intimidation. Your enemy doesn't care about your gender, she told the candidates during a combat exercise. Bullets don't discriminate, but you will face people who do care, who will try to use your gender against you. Coleman represents those people. The psychological warfare was deliberate and effective. Having Coleman present forced the candidates to perform under the kind of scrutiny they'd face in operational units. His presence was a constant reminder of the attitudes they'd encounter throughout their careers. But something unexpected began to happen. As Coleman watched the candidates excel at exercises that would challenge any male operator, his worldview underwent a fundamental shift. The women he was observing weren't trying to prove they were as good as men. They were proving they were better than anyone had imagined. I need to ask you something, Coleman said to Rebecca after the third week of training. They were alone in the facility's administrative office. The day's exercises complete. Why did you save me? Rebecca looked up from her paperwork. Save you? You could have destroyed me completely. Could have sent me to prison, ruined my life. Beyond repair. Instead, you gave me this chance to learn. To maybe make amends. Why? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the outline of her tattoo beneath her sleeve. Because David Martinez, Michael Johnson, and Robert Thompson didn't die so I could become consumed by revenge. They died believing in something bigger than themselves. She met his eyes directly. If I let hatred consume me, if I let the desire for vengeance drive my actions, then their sacrifice becomes meaningless. They'd want me to build something better, not just tear down what's broken. Coleman's transformation was visible and profound. The arrogant bully who'd made Rebecca's life miserable was being replaced by someone who understood the true cost of prejudice. But his journey wasn't about redemption. It was about education. Tell me about your daughter, Rebecca said one evening as they reviewed training footage. You mentioned she wanted to join the Navy. Coleman's face softened. Emma, she's 18 now. Just graduated high school. She's been talking about military service since she was 12. He paused, shame clouding his features. I used to tell her the military wasn't for women, that she should find something more appropriate. And now? Now, I realize I was trying to crush her dreams because of my own limitations. She's stronger than I ever was, smarter than I ever was, and she deserves the chance to serve her country in whatever capacity she chooses. Rebecca made a note in her file. Bring her to the next family day. Let her see what female operators are capable of. Let her meet her future. The program's first graduation ceremony was attended by senior military officials, congressional representatives, and media from around the world. 15 candidates had completed the grueling training, earning their place in special operations units across the military. But the most powerful moment came when Coleman was called to the podium. His speech was brief, heartfelt, and devastating in its honesty. I spent 20 years in the military believing that strength looked like me, he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. I was wrong. These women have shown me what real strength looks like. It's not about dominating others. It's about protecting them. It's not about proving your superiority. It's about service. He looked directly at Rebecca, who was standing with the other instructors. Chief Hayes saved my life by showing me what I had become. She could have destroyed me, but instead she chose to teach me. That's what real warriors do. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. Coleman's transformation had become part of the program's legend, proof that even the most entrenched attitudes could be changed through education and example. But Rebecca's greatest victory wasn't Coleman's rehabilitation. It was the letter she received from his daughter Emma, who'd been accepted to the Naval Academy and was planning to pursue special operations. "Thank you for showing my father what I was capable of," Emma wrote. "He's a different man now, and I'm proud to be his daughter again. When I graduate from the academy, I want to serve in units where women like me can succeed because of the foundation you've built." The Ghost Foundation continued its work, providing support and protection for veterans who chose to serve in civilian roles. But now it had a new mission, ensuring that the next generation of female warriors would face a culture that was ready to embrace their contributions. Rebecca had fought her war and won her victory. But the real triumph wasn't in Coleman's downfall. It was in the possibility that his daughter and thousands of women like her would never have to face the same battles that had defined Rebecca's career. The ghost of Coronado had become visible again, and the light she cast was bright enough to illuminate the path for others to follow. 2 years after the program's inception, Rebecca stood on a mountainside in Montana, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The memorial she built for David Martinez, Michael Johnson, and Robert Thompson was simple but profound. 3 granite stones arranged in a triangle, each bearing a name and the inscription, "Never Forgotten." This was where she came to run. Her daily 3 miles, one for each fallen teammate. The ritual had become sacred, a way of carrying their memory forward while honoring their sacrifice. But today was different. Today, she wasn't running alone. Emma Coleman, now a second-year midshipman at the Naval Academy, ran beside her with the easy grace of someone born to military service. The young woman had inherited her father's determination, but tempered it with wisdom that came from watching his transformation. "Tell me about them," Emma said as they crested the hill where the memorial stood. "The ones you carry." Rebecca slowed to a walk, her breathing controlled despite the altitude and pace. David was a mechanical genius. He could fix anything with spare parts and determination. Michael was our medic. He saved more lives than any doctor I've ever known. Robert was our communications specialist, but he was also our conscience. He reminded us why we were fighting. She touched each stone in turn, her fingers tracing the engraved names. They died covering my retreat, because that's what warriors do for each other. They didn't hesitate, didn't calculate the odds, didn't think about their own safety. They just acted. Emma stood quietly, understanding that she was witnessing something sacred. "Is that why you saved my father? Because it's what they would have done?" Rebecca's smile was sad but genuine. "Your father was broken, not evil." Broken. Things can be fixed if someone cares enough to try. David, Michael, and Robert would have tried to save him, just like they tried to save me. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Frank Torres emerged from the tree line, followed by Derek Coleman. The 2 men had formed an unlikely friendship over the past year, bonded by their shared commitment to supporting Rebecca's mission. "Morning, Chief," Torres said, using the rank that Rebecca had never truly abandoned. "Brought you something." He handed her an official-looking envelope bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. Rebecca opened it carefully, her expression growing serious as she read the contents. "What is it?" Emma asked, concern evident in her voice. "Congressional testimony," Rebecca replied, folding the letter carefully. "They want me to speak before the Armed Services Committee about the future of women in special operations." Coleman stepped forward, his voice carrying the humility that had replaced his former arrogance. You have to do it. Your voice can change everything for the next generation. Rebecca looked around at the small group assembled on the mountainside. Emma, young and eager, representing the future of female warriors. Torres, steady and reliable, embodying the bonds of brotherhood that transcended service. Coleman, broken and rebuilt, proof that redemption was possible even for those who'd lost their way. I left that world behind for a reason, she said quietly. I came here to serve in silence, to honor the dead without seeking glory for myself. But silence isn't serving them anymore, Emma said, her voice carrying the passion of youth, tempered by wisdom beyond her years. Your story, your example, your program, they're changing everything. Don't stop now. Rebecca walked to the edge of the overlook, gazing out at the valley below. In the distance, she could see the small town where she built her new life, where the Ghost Foundation's headquarters operated in anonymity. The work continued, supporting veterans and their families, but the mission had evolved. David always said that the best way to honor the dead was to protect the living, she said finally. Maybe it's time to protect them in a different way. She turned back to the group, her decision made. I'll testify, but not as the ghost of Coronado. I'll speak as Rebecca Hayes, teacher and advocate. The ghost can rest. The testimony 3 weeks later was carried live on every major news network. Rebecca spoke with the same precision and clarity that had made her legendary and special. Operations, but her message was different now. She talked about service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of strength. Warriors aren't made in training facilities, she told the assembled congressmen and senators. They're forged in the crucible of service, tested by adversity, and proven by their willingness to sacrifice for others. Gender doesn't determine character, actions do. She spoke about the women who graduated from her program, now serving with distinction in special operations units around the world. She talked about the men who'd learned to see strength in new ways, who'd become better leaders by embracing diversity rather than fearing it. But her most powerful words were about Derek Coleman, sitting in the gallery behind her. Redemption is possible, she said, her voice carrying across the chamber. Even for those who've lost their way, even for those who've caused harm, even for those who've forgotten what they swore to protect. Private Coleman's transformation proves that education and example can overcome even the most entrenched prejudices. The impact was immediate and profound. Military academies across the country began implementing programs based on Rebecca's model. The Ghost Foundation received federal funding to expand its work. Most importantly, the culture began to shift. Coleman's daughter, Emma, graduated from the Naval Academy with honors, commissioning as an officer in the Navy's Special Operations community. Her father was there to pin on her insignia, tears streaming down his face as he realized that his daughter had achieved something he'd never imagined possible. I'm proud of you, he whispered as they embraced. Your mother would be proud too. Rebecca watched from the audience, surrounded by graduates of her program who'd returned to witness this moment. The circle was complete. The man who'd tried to break her spirit was now celebrating his daughter's entry into the world he'd once tried to deny her. But the real victory wasn't in Coleman's transformation or Emma's success. It was in the knowledge that the next generation of female warriors would face a different world, one where their contributions were valued and their sacrifices honored. 5 years after her identity was revealed, Rebecca returned to the Montana Memorial for the last time. The Ghost Foundation was thriving under new leadership. The training program had been adopted by military services worldwide, and the culture that had once seemed impossible to change was evolving. She knelt beside the 3 stones, placing fresh flowers on each one. I kept the promise, she said quietly. The work continues, but it's in good hands now. As she prepared to leave, she noticed something that made her smile. Someone had left a small flag beside Robert Thompson's stone. Not an American flag, but a simple banner bearing the insignia of the 1st All-Female Special Operations Unit. The ghost of Coronado had become something more than legend. She'd become a catalyst for change, proof that one person's courage could transform an entire culture. The shadows she'd once inhabited were gone, replaced by the light of progress and the promise of a better future. In the end, true strength wasn't about being invisible. It was about being visible when visibility mattered most. Rebecca Hayes had learned that lesson the hard way, but she'd learned it well. The dead were finally at rest, and the living were free to become everything they dreamed of being. Some ghosts, it turned out, were meant to be seen. As Rebecca walked away from the memorial for the final time, 3 birds took flight from the surrounding trees, a cardinal, a blue jay, and a hawk, rising together into the infinite Montana sky. Their wings caught the first light of dawn, like souls finally set free. The ghost of Coronado had served her purpose. Now it was time for the legend to give way to the next generation of warriors who would carry the torch forward, ensuring that no one would ever again have to fight alone in the shadows. The story had ended, but the mission continued. And that, Rebecca knew, was exactly as it should be. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.